Heartbreaking news today about former talk show host Wendy Williams.
A piece of paper fell from a window 5 floors above the street. The photographers standing on the sidewalk below picked it up and read what was written on it. Just 2 words. Help. Wendy. For 14 years, 3 million Americans tuned in every single day to watch a woman say out loud what everyone else only thought in private. She named the scandals. She exposed the secrets. She looked directly into the camera and spoke truths that publicists spent fortunes trying to suppress. Nobody silenced Wendy Williams. And then she vanished. Not with a farewell episode, not with a standing ovation. She vanished while someone else legally took control of her life, her finances, her health care, where she could live and who could have access to her. In November of 2025, an independent neurologist examined Wendy Williams and reached a conclusion that shook the legal foundation of the guardianship governing her life. The diagnosis that put her there may not be accurate. Her legal team called it vindication. The court has not yet ruled. How did the most powerful woman in American daytime television end up inside a system she cannot control? Who truly benefited when she lost control of her own voice? And what does it mean when the woman who spent a career making sure no one's story was buried quietly becomes the one whose story the system has the power to bury? Before we can answer any of that, we have to go back to the beginning. To a girl in Asbury Park, New Jersey, who was simply too much for every room she walked into. Wendy Joan Williams was born on the 18th of July, 1964, in Asbury Park, New Jersey. She was the middle child of 3, older brother Thomas, younger sister Wanda, raised in a household in Ocean Township that valued order, discipline, and respectability above almost everything else. Her father, Thomas Williams Sr., was a school teacher and later a school administrator. Her mother, Shirley, was a special education teacher. They were educated people, stable people, people who believed in doing things the right way and keeping private matters private. Wendy was none of those things. From the beginning, she was loud where the house was quiet, bold where her parents were measured, and relentlessly curious about everything the adults around her seemed determined not to discuss. She was not the child who blended in. She was not the child who was easy. She was the child who asked the questions nobody wanted to answer, and then told everyone what she had found out. A quality that would one day make her a legend, and that, as a girl growing up in New Jersey in the 1970s, made her something considerably more complicated to manage. She was not the golden child of the family. That distinction belonged to others. Wendy would later say, with the particular candor that became her signature, that she always felt like the outlier, the one who did not quite fit the mold her parents had carefully constructed. Not bad, not broken, just too much, too loud, too curious, too interested in things that polite households preferred to leave alone. And yet, it was precisely that quality, that refusal to be quiet, that absolute inability to pretend she did not know what she knew, that would carry her further than anyone in that Ocean Township house could have imagined in 1964. She was not born into the spotlight. She was born reaching for it, in a family that would have preferred she reach for something else. The beginning of a legend is rarely comfortable for the people who have to live with it first. Wendy Williams did not stumble into radio. She decided on it with the same blunt, unmovable certainty that would later define every segment of her television career. She studied communications at Northeastern University in Boston, graduating in 1986. And from the moment she sat in front of her first microphone, something became immediately clear to everyone in the room. This woman was not going to be told what she could and could not say. Her early career moved through small markets first: Delaware, St. Croix in the Virgin Islands. Each station a stepping stone, each audience a rehearsal for the one that actually mattered. She was developing something in those early years that could not be taught in a classroom and could not be manufactured in a production meeting. A voice. Not just a radio voice, though she had that too, full and commanding and impossible to ignore. A point of view. A willingness to say the specific thing that everyone else in the industry had quietly agreed to leave unsaid. She arrived in New York City in 1989. And New York, the hardest, most competitive radio market in the country, did not soften her. It sharpened her. She landed at WVIS and then moved through a series of stations before finding her footing at WBLS and later at Hot 97, where she became something the New York radio world had not quite seen before. A woman who would discuss a celebrity's personal life with the same directness, the same lack of apology, and the same forensic attention to detail that male hosts had always reserved for sports statistics and political arguments. She named names. She sourced gossip with a discipline that bordered on journalistic. She said, on air, in real time, to hundreds of thousands of listeners, things that publicists spent enormous amounts of money trying to keep off the air. The industry did not love her for it. Not immediately. She was fired. More than once. Stations grew uncomfortable with the volume of what she was willing to say, and the speed at which the subjects of her commentary called to complain. She was told to tone it down. She was told that certain topics were off limits. She was told, repeatedly, by people with the authority to end her career, that the way she operated was not sustainable. She ignored all of it, because the listeners, the actual human beings tuning in every morning in their cars and their kitchens across the 5 boroughs and beyond, those listeners were not asking her to be quieter. They were calling in by the tens of thousands, asking her to go further. The ratings told the story that her bosses were reluctant to admit. Wendy Williams was not a problem to be managed. She was an audience to be cultivated. By the time she landed at WBLS and then at her defining home station, WQHT, known as Hot 97, she had built something that no program director had given her and no corporate mandate had created. She had built a following of people who trusted her specifically because she said the things that the carefully constructed machinery of celebrity public relations worked every single day to suppress. She was not playing a character. She was not performing outrage for ratings. She was, and this is what her most devoted listeners understood before anyone else did, simply telling the truth as she experienced it, at full volume, without apology, in real time. That quality made her enemies in every green room in Manhattan. It also made her, by the early 2000s, one of the most listened-to radio personalities in New York City, a market where that distinction meant something serious, something concrete, something that could not be ignored forever by the television executives who were already watching. The radio booth could not hold her much longer. Something larger was coming. The Wendy Williams Show premiered on the 5th of July, 2008. It was not an immediate sensation. The first season was a regional syndication deal, limited markets, modest expectations, the kind of cautious rollout that television executives give to properties they believe in just enough to test, but not enough to fully commit to. Wendy Williams did not operate on cautious rollouts. She operated on certainty. By the second season, the show was in national syndication. By the third, it was the most watched daytime talk show in America among its target demographic. At its peak, somewhere in the window between 2012 and 2017, The Wendy Williams Show was drawing close to 3 million viewers per episode. 3 million people, every weekday, sitting down to watch a woman in a sequined dress walk out onto a stage, lower herself into a chair that had been custom-built for her, look directly into the camera, and say, "How you doing?" Those 3 words became one of the most recognized phrases in American daytime television. A greeting, a provocation, a signal to everyone watching that whatever came next was going to be said without a filter, without a net, and without the particular kind of institutional caution that governed every other program in the same time slot. The Hot Topics segment was the engine of the show. Every episode opened with it. Wendy at the desk, a stack of tabloids and entertainment news items in front of her. A live studio audience that had come specifically to watch her dismantle the carefully managed public images of the most famous people in the world. She talked about marriages. She talked about addictions. She talked about feuds that publicists had spent months trying to keep below the surface. She named people. She gave details. She offered opinions that were frequently uncomfortable and occasionally devastating, and almost always, in some fundamental sense, correct. She was sued. She was threatened. She received letters from entertainment lawyers representing clients who wanted her to retract, to apologize, to stop. She retracted very little. She apologized selectively. She did not stop. The show ran for 14 seasons. In that time, she interviewed virtually every significant name in American entertainment. Actors, musicians, reality television personalities, athletes, political figures, comedians. She was not a soft interviewer. She did not ask the questions that the publicist had pre-approved. She asked the questions that the publicist had specifically requested she not ask. And she did so with a smile and a directness that made it almost impossible for the subject across from her to be angry without looking exactly as guilty as she was implying they were. She was also, and this is the part of the Wendy Williams story that gets lost in the noise of the Hot Topics highlights, a genuine businesswoman. She negotiated her own contracts. She built a production company. She had a clothing line, a fragrance, a book deal, a radio presence that continued alongside the television show. She was not a personality managed by a corporation. She was, for a significant period of her professional life, the corporation. And she did all of it while managing a marriage that was, by most accounts, far more complicated than the version she presented to the public, and a body that was working against her in ways she had only partially disclosed. The Graves' disease diagnosis came in 2018. The lymphedema, a chronic condition causing painful swelling in the lower limbs, had been with her longer than that. She had been managing both conditions on camera, in sequined dresses, on 4-inch heels, in front of studio audiences who did not know the degree to which every single episode represented a physical act of will. She told America everything, except the parts that were quietly destroying her. And those parts were closing in. Kevin Hunter had been in Wendy Williams' life for more than 2 decades. He was her husband. He was her manager. He was the co-executive producer of her show. He was, in the architecture of everything she had constructed professionally and personally, the central load-bearing wall. And in April of 2019, that wall came down. The circumstances were not ambiguous. Hunter had fathered a child with another woman, a woman named Sharina Hudson, with whom he had maintained a years-long relationship while married to Williams. The child was born in March of 2019. Williams filed for divorce the following month. She announced it on her show, in front of her studio audience, in the direct and unflinching manner that had always been her default register. She wore her wedding ring to the announcement. She took it off on camera. She told her audience that she would be okay. She was not okay. The divorce was not simply the end of a marriage, it was the simultaneous dismantling of a professional infrastructure that had been built over more than 20 years around a single partnership. Hunter was removed from the show. The management structure that had governed her career, that had negotiated her contracts, shaped her public image, managed her business relationships, was gone. And Williams, at 54 years old, with Graves' disease and lymphedema, and a television show she was still required to produce 5 days a week, was now navigating all of it alone. The financial consequences were significant. The emotional consequences were, by her own subsequent account, even more so. She had loved Kevin Hunter, genuinely, completely, in the way that people love someone who has been at the center of their existence for more than half their adult life. The betrayal was not an abstraction. It was a daily, concrete, visible reality in the form of a child that existed as proof of everything she had not known. The show continued. She went back to work. She sat in the chair. She said, "How you doing?" She talked about hot topics. She interviewed guests. And she gave her audience no indication, or very little indication, of the degree to which the ground beneath her had fundamentally shifted. But the cracks were becoming visible. Her absences from the show grew more frequent. Episodes were missed, explanations were offered. The Graves' disease, the lymphedema, the general toll of a production schedule that would have challenged someone in perfect health. Her behavior in certain public appearances began to generate quiet concern among people who had known her for years. There were moments on the show itself, small moments, easy to dismiss in isolation, that, viewed in retrospect, suggested something beyond fatigue and beyond the ordinary grief of a difficult divorce. In June of 2022, the Wendy Williams show ended. It did not end with a farewell season and a tribute episode, and the kind of ceremonial conclusion that 14 years of daytime dominance arguably warranted. It ended because Wendy Williams was no longer able to produce it. The final episode aired without her. Sherry Shepherd, who had been guest hosting during Williams's extended absences, was given the time slot. The show that had carried Williams's name, her voice, her face, and her singular point of view for 14 seasons was replaced, in the same studio, on the same stage, with a program hosted by someone else. Williams did not appear to say goodbye. 1 month before the show ended, in May of 2022, something had already happened that would prove far more consequential than the cancellation. Wells Fargo, the banking institution managing certain of Williams's accounts, filed a petition with a New York court. The petition alleged that Williams was a, and these are the words the filing used, incapacitated person and a victim of undue influence and financial exploitation. The bank alleged that her finances had been mismanaged to a degree that required judicial intervention. The court agreed. Sabrina Morrissey was appointed as Williams's legal guardian. The guardianship gave Morrissey legal authority over Williams's financial decisions and her healthcare decisions, including, critically, decisions about where Williams would live and who would have access to her. Wendy Williams, the woman who had spent 14 years telling America who was really in control of every celebrity's life, was no longer in control of her own. The question of whether that loss of control was a necessary protection or something else entirely is the question that has divided her legal team, her guardianship, and the court that oversees both of them ever since. And it is a question that has still not been answered. In February of 2024, the team managing Wendy Williams's care made a public announcement. The announcement confirmed what many people who had been watching her closely. On screen, in public appearances, in the scattered and increasingly concerning glimpses the public had been permitted, had begun to suspect. Williams had been diagnosed with 2 conditions, primary progressive aphasia and frontotemporal dementia. The diagnoses, the announcement explained, had been reached following comprehensive testing conducted at Weill Cornell Medicine in 2023. The language used in the announcement was clinical and careful. The diagnoses, it said, explained the behavioral changes and cognitive issues that had been observed over the preceding years. Williams had been placed in a licensed care facility, a supervised living environment in New York City, where she was receiving the level of support her condition was said to require. The public response was grief, genuine, widespread, unperformed grief from an audience that had spent 14 years watching this woman be the most alive person in any room she entered. The talk show host, who had never been at a loss for words, had been diagnosed with a condition that attacks, specifically and progressively, the capacity for language and cognition. The cruelty of that particular symmetry was not lost on anyone. Also in February of 2024, a documentary aired on the Lifetime Network. It was called Where is Wendy Williams? It had been produced with Williams's participation. She had agreed, at some point before the full weight of her diagnosis had become apparent, to allow cameras access to her life. What those cameras captured and what the documentary showed to the American public was deeply difficult to watch. Williams appeared confused in certain scenes, disoriented. The woman on screen did not move or speak with the precision and authority that 14 years of daily television had made familiar. The documentary was not a tabloid ambush. It was, in its way, something more unsettling. A record of a real person in real difficulty, shown to the audience that had loved her. And then, in January of 2025, something happened that nobody had predicted. Wendy Williams called into The Breakfast Club. The Breakfast Club is one of the most listened-to morning radio programs in America. Williams did not give advance notice. She did not have a publicist coordinate the appearance. She called in from wherever she was, under whatever circumstances she was living, and she spoke. And what she said was not the speech of a woman in the late stages of a progressive neurological condition. What she said was pointed, specific, and delivered with a clarity that stunned the hosts and everyone listening. She said, "I am not cognitively impaired, but I feel like I am in prison. I'm in this place with people who are in their 90s and their 80s and their 70s. I don't belong here at all. This is ridiculous." She was asked about the frontotemporal dementia diagnosis. Her response, delivered in the flat, unimpressed tone she had always reserved for claims she found beneath serious consideration, was, "Frontotemporal dementia? Ah, how dare you." The legal and medical establishment surrounding the guardianship did not immediately respond with a public statement. The guardianship remained in place. The court order that governed Williams' living situation and financial affairs did not change as a result of the radio call. But the call had done something that no legal filing and no documentary and no press release had managed to do. It had put Williams's own voice, unmediated, unmanaged, and unmistakably her, back into the public conversation about her own life. It is important to be precise about what the call did and did not establish. It did not constitute a medical assessment. It did not overturn the diagnoses reached at Weill Cornell Medicine. The guardianship and the court that had approved it operated on the basis of medical and legal documentation that a single radio interview could not unilaterally supersede. The guardianship said the call was not evidence of capacity. Williams's legal team said it was exactly that. Then, in 2026, came the window. 5 floors above the street. A piece of paper falling through the air toward the photographers below. 2 words written on it. Help. Wendy. She was subsequently transported to a hospital for a medical evaluation to determine whether she was in a condition to seek the termination of the guardianship. The woman who had spent a career making sure that nobody's story went untold had just told her own, in the most stripped-down, unambiguous way available to her. The question was whether anyone with the legal authority to act on it was listening. What happened next? In November of 2025, in the office of a New York neurologist, would change the legal and medical landscape of this case in ways that nobody involved had fully anticipated. In November of 2025, a story broke across two of the most reliable celebrity news operations in America, TMZ and Page 6, that did not read like a typical entertainment industry item. It read like a legal document. It read like a medical record. It read like the kind of information that, once it enters a courtroom, has the potential to change the entire structure of the proceedings around it. A neurologist in New York City, a specialist brought in to conduct an independent examination of Wendy Williams, had reached a conclusion that directly contradicted the diagnosis that had been used to justify the guardianship now governing her life. The neurologist's finding, as reported by both outlets, was unambiguous in its direction. Wendy Williams did not have frontotemporal dementia. The diagnosis that had been announced in February of 2024, the diagnosis described as the result of comprehensive testing at Weill Cornell Medicine in 2023, the diagnosis that had framed the public understanding of Williams's condition and had provided the medical foundation for the continuation of a guardianship that controlled her finances and her physical location. That diagnosis, according to this new examination, was not accurate. The sources close to Williams's legal team went further. They told both outlets that the doctors who had previously been involved in her care had, in effect, walked back the frontotemporal dementia finding. The phrase used in the reporting, that Williams had demonstrated remarkable neurological resilience, was connected explicitly to a significant change in her personal circumstances. She had been free of substance use for approximately 3 years. The implication, as reported, was that certain cognitive and behavioral symptoms that had been attributed to a progressive neurological disease may have had a different origin, one that was treatable, and one from which meaningful recovery was possible. It is essential to be precise here, because precision is what this particular moment in the story demands. The new neurological finding does not mean that the original diagnosis was fraudulent. It does not mean that the doctors at Weill Cornell Medicine acted improperly. Medical diagnoses, particularly in cases involving complex neurological conditions, are not always static. New information, changed circumstances, and independent examination can produce different conclusions. What the November 2025 finding established was not that the original doctors were wrong in bad faith. What it established was that a credentialed specialist examining Williams in her current condition reached a different conclusion, a conclusion that her legal team argued changed the medical basis on which the guardianship had been built. The legal team moved quickly. Attorney Joe Tacopina, a prominent New York litigator who had taken on Williams's case, filed documentation with the court presenting the new neurological findings and formally requesting the termination of the guardianship. The filing argued that if the diagnosis underpinning the guardianship was no longer medically supported, the legal justification for the guardianship itself required urgent re-examination. Tacopina was direct about the stakes and about his next step if the court did not move. He stated publicly that he was prepared to demand a jury trial to secure Williams's freedom if the judge declined to act on the new medical evidence. A source close to the legal team told reporters, "This is vindication. The results change everything." Sabrina Morrissey, the court-appointed guardian who had controlled Williams's finances and health care since 2022, did not issue a public comment on the new neurological findings. The guardianship, as a legal structure, remained in place. A guardianship established by a court order is not dissolved by a press report or by a legal filing alone. It requires a judicial determination, and the court had not yet made one. That absence of a judicial ruling is not a procedural footnote. It is the central, unresolved fact of this entire case. Both diagnoses now exist in the record. The original finding from Weill Cornell Medicine and the contradicting finding from November 2025. The court has not determined which is correct. No judge has ruled that the guardianship was established on a false medical foundation. No judicial authority has declared that Wendy Williams was wrongly placed under legal control. Those determinations remain outstanding. In March of 2026, something happened outside the courtrooms and the medical offices and the legal filings that had defined this story for years. Fans gathered at Wendy Williams' star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame in Los Angeles. They gathered in New York City. They held signs. They called for her release. The public, the audience that had watched her for 14 years, that had called in to her radio show, that had sat in her studio audience and laughed at hot topics and said, "How you doin'?" back to her. That public had not forgotten her. They were not prepared to let the story end in silence. Wendy Williams had spent a career making noise on behalf of people whose stories were being quietly managed by the people around them. Now, the people who had listened to her for 14 years were making noise on her behalf. Whether it would be enough, whether the courts would move, whether the guardianship would end, whether the woman in the fifth-floor room would walk out of it on her own terms, none of that had been decided. The court had the file. The neurologist had submitted the findings. The legal team had made the argument, and Wendy Williams was still waiting. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a story when all the arguments have been made, all the documents have been filed, all the witnesses have spoken, and the institution with the authority to decide has not yet decided. It is not the silence of resolution. It is not the silence of peace. It is the silence of a question left open in a room where the walls are closing in and the clock is running and the person at the center of everything is still, after all of it, waiting. That is where Wendy Williams is today. The guardianship that was established in May of 2022 remains legally in force. Sabrina Morrissey remains the court-appointed guardian. The new neurological finding from November of 2025, the finding that concluded Williams does not have frontotemporal dementia, has been submitted to the court. Joe Tacopina has made the legal argument. The fans have gathered at the Star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. The piece of paper that fell from the fifth-floor window has been photographed and reported and analyzed. And the court has not yet issued a ruling that resolves the central question this case has always been about. Was Wendy Williams placed under guardianship because she genuinely needed protection? Or because the system that was supposed to protect her moved faster than the truth could catch up? Both narratives remain standing. The guardianship and the court-approved record say she needed protection, medical, financial, personal, and that the structure put in place around her was a lawful response to a documented crisis. Her legal team and the new neurological finding say the medical foundation of that structure was not accurate, and that a woman who is not cognitively incapacitated has been living for years under legal arrangements that removed her autonomy and her freedom of movement. No court has declared the guardianship illegitimate. That fact matters. It must be stated clearly, and it must be stated without qualification. Because the integrity of this story depends on not deciding, on behalf of the judicial system, a question the judicial system has not yet decided. What can be said, what the record clearly supports, is this. Wendy Williams built something extraordinary. She built it out of nerve and volume, and a refusal to be edited that was so complete, so constitutive of who she was, that it is impossible to separate the woman from the quality. She told America the truth as she saw it, every weekday, for 14 years. And America, 3 million people at a time, showed up to listen. She deserves to have her own story told with the same rigor she brought to everyone else's. Both sides of it, all of it. Without a verdict that the facts do not yet support, the question that remains, the one that belongs to the court, not to this broadcast, is whether the system that took control of her life will return it to her, and on what terms and when. And the question that belongs to everyone who is watching, to you, sitting here now, having followed this story from the beginning, is simpler and older and more human than any legal filing. What does it mean when the woman who spent a career making sure that no one's story was buried quietly becomes the person whose story the system has the power to bury? If this story stayed with you, leave a tribute for Wendy Williams below. She spent 14 years giving a voice to stories that powerful people wanted kept quiet. She earned the same in return. Subscribe if you believe that every story, even the most complicated, even the most unresolved, even the ones where the court has not yet spoken, deserves to be told with honesty, with balance, and without looking away. The court has not answered. Wendy Williams is still waiting. So are we.